Welcome to my Sony A7S III dynamic range test video. That's a bit of a mouthful, but this is something new that I'm trying. I'm presenting it like this. I haven't done this before. This is my office that's much smaller than, well, I don't know, it probably looks pretty small too, but this is like just a mess and a mess. And then a little bit clean there. And so this seemed like a perfect opportunity to test out, to use my new dynamic range chart that I've been developing that takes advantage of phone AMOLED screen, which is a extremely wide contrast ratio display that you can use. I'm hoping that actually seems like it works pretty well as a dynamic range chart, because you can basically display a near infinite dynamic range. Technically, I really only would want to use the top end of it because of bit depth issues of the hardware and of the file formats that I'd be using. But I created a dynamic range test chart that, you know, for a reflective one, you really only can get a couple of stops. You can get if you lighted you know, unless you're using Vantablack or something, which I don't know if that's even possible yet, but if you're, you know, most dynamic range test charts that are based on reflectance, you know, reflected light on a matte surface, you can really only get a couple stops out of those. But this one is designed to display at least 12 stops constantly, which, you know, you might say seems like not enough, given these cameras are supposed to do 14, 15, 16 stops of dynamic range. But I would suggest that those, you know, those top 12 stops are where everything really is. You know, unless you're pushing your image 5 stops, you're really looking at almost all these cameras allocate about 6 stops for highlights and another, you know, 6 or 7 stops for shadows. And then the stuff below that, you know, it can be represented by a lot of these cameras, but it's so compressed on the gamma curve that you would never look at it in a high contrast way. You'd never be able to discern detail in that range, or try to pull color out of that range, unless you know, and nobody's really going to be pushing their images 5, 6 stops really. What this allows me to do is basically be able to look at, based on where white clip is on these cameras, figure out where, you know, I can figure out what the curve looks like, how these cameras represent contrast, and then I can actually look at all in one image, in one exposure in each of these cameras. I can look at, you know, a 4-stop over and a 4-stop under and a normal exposure all in one place, and I can compare these cameras in those terms, and looking at what, you know, so you can really represent all the usable range of these cameras. Because, you know, I mean, most people, you know, talk about dynamic range. There are a lot of different ways of actually quantifying it. There are certain, you know, there are a lot of certain popular ones. Usually, you know, you're either looking at something like Cinema 5D or Cine-D or whatever it's called now uses, which is, you know, they use a Xyla chart, and then they run an IMA-test analysis of it, and usually use signal noise ratio equals 2 analysis of the, you know, what the noise looks like at a particular part of the image. But I find that that's really doesn't capture what we're looking at when we look for dynamic range, because there's no because you really need to be able to look at, you know, looking at noise is always going to be qualitative to some degree. There's, you know, especially when you're dealing with codecs, when you're dealing with all different kinds of interfering factors. So you really need to see it, you know, because you can look at, you know, for example, the Cinema 5D did the test of the C300 Mark III versus the C500 Mark II, and showed underexposures. And then they also showed their IMA-test version, and it doesn't make any sense, because it's you know, according to the IMA-test, it says their signal noise ratio equals 2. You know, analysis is that it has 12 stops or something. It's just over 12 stops, but then, which actually puts it just below a C500 Mark II, but then you look at the underexposures, and it's very clear that the C300 Mark III has way more dynamic range, because you can underexpose it by 4 stops and still get a pretty clear image. I wouldn't call it clean, but clear image that you could run noise reduction on, and you could actually use that. Whereas on most of these other cameras, you really can't do that. You're really looking at most cameras you can depending on how much highlight exposure, obviously, is already accounted for, depending on how the manufacturer specifies highlight dynamic range, you're looking only at maybe 1 or 2. Maybe you could underexpose by 1 or 2 stops and pull a usable image out of it. Because that's what I really care about. What I want to know is, can I shoot with these cameras that most of them have 6 to 7 stops of highlights? Can I underexpose them by 1 or even 2 stops, maybe even 3 stops, and still get and then get highlight protection similar to that of an ARRI, an Alexa or something? Because ARRI is known for their amazing highlights, and that's partly because they just calibrate their highlights differently. They calibrate it, they find their white clip, and then they drop, and then 7.5 stops or so below that, that's where they put their midtones. Whereas a lot of these cameras, especially ZCam, Sony, Panasonic, pretty much all of them, they've designed their log curves, the V-log, S-log, around 6 stops over. You find your white clip, 6 stops under that is where they put midtones. So what you really want is to be able to underexpose relative to that. And that's kind of hard to capture in a lot of dynamic range videos, because if you do over-unders, you're basing it on essentially arbitrary manufacturer numbers. You're basing it on, oh, this is what this manufacturer says is ISO 800, but it doesn't tell you anything about what the highlights look like. They all look a little different. Some of them have 6 stops, some have 6.5, some have 6 3/4 or something. And it's you can't really compare dynamic range if you're not normalizing the highlight dynamic range. You can't do it in those over-unders. So what you need to do is to really understand finite, the full dynamic range, you have to throw away all the manufacturer stuff, all the manufacturer calibrations of this is what we say this ISO look is supposed to be, and what the highlights are supposed to be at that ISO, and just look at the highlights, and then that'll tell you, and look at, expose a wide contrast ratio, in this case a chart, and put the white clip in exactly the same place on every single camera, and then look at the shadows and what the shadows and even what the midtones are doing. So anyway, this is my new chart. The way it's designed, it has a 4-stop sections. It has the top section, it represents 4 stops of dynamic range. The middle section represents 4 stops of dynamic range, and the bottom section represents essentially 4 stops of dynamic range. So it's basically 12 stops. The last one has a little more than that, probably because the off on an OLED is actually 0, basically. The last couple steps are much greater, probably. But it's all normalized because we're looking at the same chart on the same screen, on the same display, basically. All these cameras are seeing the same thing. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It does help for me to be able to know that the top and the middle section are exactly 4 stops, and I've calibrated so they're exactly 4 stops of each other. So that the middle gray on the middle chart is 4 stops away from the one on the upper chart. So one important thing is testing any new camera. You really have to understand the camera before you can test it, because you really need to know, what settings. You want to make sure that there's no confounding factors. There's no, using the wrong codec is going to limit your dynamic range, or even just because it's a camera that I'm really interested in, I need to know, what the best settings are, and I need to know, and you don't want to get tripped up by anything, run all these tests, and then find out that you have to do it again. So I did the tests all in, I tested the codecs first. I tested all the different codecs. They're pretty similar. One thing that I can note is that the HS, the H.265 on the A7S III, it's very CPU heavy, which everyone knows that. But one thing that I did find is that I saw this pulsing in my HS clips where it was really, you could tell where the keyframes were, because you'd see the noise sort of blur together, and then it would normalize. It look right, and then it would blur together, and then it would look right, and you could really see where it was like basically pulsing noise, because the noise would sort of blur together until it hit a keyframe, and that's just not good. That means that it is not rendering this noise properly. So I would not trust HS, which is, you know, actually in some ways good, because I wouldn't want to edit it anyway. And actually in my test, the XAVC-S 4K is really good. I wasn't really able to find any significant differences in it between the A7S, the XAVC-S and the XAVC-SI, because you know, even it benefits from, you know, from the long GOP encoding, so it gets to compress things based on temporal changes and on frame-based, you know, detail. So it has that benefit. So, you know, which normally you would think it would be quite bad at compressing noise, but you know, it does look, it's possible that the noise looks a little less natural, but there's enough noise processing in these cameras already that, you know, you're not really gaining anything by going to SI, except it may be easier to edit because it doesn't have to, you know, process interframes. It doesn't have to decode a bunch of previous frames to get, you know, the current frame. Whereas in, you know, in the SI mode, you can really, the XAVC-SI, it's each frame is like a separate still, and it just has to decode the frame that you're on. So that's the main benefit. I think, you know, for most people, if you have the space, which most people do, for a 240 megabit codec, I would use that. But you know, I wouldn't be afraid to use XAVC-S 10-bit 422, because actually in my tests, I tested it also against my A7S II, which I since sold in the past week actually. But you know, I knew a lot about, I've used that camera extensively, and I know the 8-bit XAVC-S 420 is just, you know, I know where it falls apart. You know, it's pretty good for what it is, for most stuff, for the web, even commercial. I've shot, you know, commercials on it. And, you know, if you know what to do with it, if you don't underexpose it at all, then it actually looks pretty great. You know, you have to be a little careful. It gets all these blotches and stuff, and the compression is pretty heavy. You can't push it around too far, but it looks all right for what it is. But so I tested against that, and the 10-bit 422, even though it's essentially the same codec but with, you know, added bit depth, I don't know, maybe they improved the encoder or something, but it's much better. It doesn't have it does have some of the, you know, the blockiness, the chroma blockiness at the very, very low end, but it comes in about, you know, 3 stops lower than the A7S II, which you'll see. The couple of things I knew going into this are, you know, and that you can verify very easily as soon as you have your hands on the camera, is that ISO 640 and ISO 12800 are by far the cleanest settings. So I figured, let's test those. Those are the primary ones I want to focus on. I did test all of the ISOs, which I'll show you later. But for purposes of, you know, putting it against these heavy hitters that are more expensive cameras, that, you know, a 6K, you know, full frame camera and a 5K, you know, red raw, you know, high sensitivity camera, supposedly, that I'm very familiar with both these cameras. So I really just wanted to see how this stacks up and see what, you know, where it fits in my lineup. So the first test I did was the base ISO dynamic range test, and you'll see that I tested against the A7S II. I tested against the ZCam E2-F6, which is a 6K full frame camera, and I tested against the red Gemini 5K, and the old Sony A7S II, just because it's a great benchmark. It's like the clear thing that people are going to be upgrading from to the A7S III. So it really gives you a good sense of what you're getting in this new camera. I found some interesting things with the ISO dynamic range, but you see like looking at these cameras together, you can see right away that the A7S III looks pretty close to the Gemini. Like, obviously there's some, some processing that's going on that's not happening in the red raw. The red raw is really good for, you know, retaining noise, character, and retaining color, even deep into the shadows, retaining, you know, very similar and, you know, color that doesn't shift as you push it. It's not the case with all their cameras, but the Gemini is really good for that. And whereas you look at the E2-F6, I should note that this was, I've done a lot of tests on this camera previously, and I also tested this again and found that the ProRes 422 seemed like the best. The 6K for ProRes 422 that I tested on the ZCam, and it because it, you know, it seemed like the best option, because I've tested extensively those Z raw, and it actually looks really bad. And if you push it a little bit, you start to see these red splotches. I think it's just because of the raw compression just doesn't handle noise. I mean, red has problems with that too to some degree, but you really don't see that in this range, especially with this good sensor. Whereas with the E2-F6, you really start to see that you lose color saturation in the shadows. You're losing, you know, the detail's still there. I tested this, you know, tested the other codecs in the E2-F6, and it similar results. The raw was noisier as you'd expect, but it wasn't really better in any way. It had this blocky reddish noise, and it didn't really retain more color. And, you know, it was also huge. And then I also tested the H.265, which actually looks quite similar to the ProRes, except that it has, instead of a red cast, it has more of a green cast. It has similar problems with color saturation in the shadows. You know, a lot of the stuff you might not see unless you were pushing the images around. But this is all, you know, any of these cameras, you know, if you're looking at this, even if it's not pushed 2 stops or 3 stops, you can still see this stuff in the shadows. It's just a matter of whether, you know, what might become more important in those situations is how the midtone noise looks. So you can see that in the upper section of each camera. That's sort of the midtone area. All of these cameras actually have dual conversion gain, dual native ISO. So that goes, the E2-F6 has a conversion gain that changes from, there's the low one is ISO 400 and high one is 2500, and the red Gemini has what's called standard mode and low light mode, which are different conversion gains, and they both have a full range of ISOs that you can adjust to, that change the highlight and shadow compression depending on how you want to expose your image. And then the A7S III, you know, has a little bit of a different system. And it's actually somewhat similar to the E2-F6, where at a certain ISO, it kicks in. So at A7S III, most people probably know this. I know Gerald, Undone, and Phil Bloom both confirmed basically that it has dual native ISO, or at least has what, as far as we can tell, should be practically treated as dual native ISO. So there's the low one is at 640, and then the high one is 12,800, and you'll really see it. I mean, I'll show you later when we step through all the ISOs and look at the dynamic range of all of the ISOs. So one thing to know when looking at this chart is that there is no you don't use this as a low light comparison. What we're looking at is if you're in low light and you're using the best, you know, what the best these sensors have to offer in a low light situation, basically. They're going to be 2 different low light situations, because it's not going to be, what we're really just looking at is comparing the dynamic range of the high gain modes of each of these cameras, of the best high gain modes of these cameras. So I wouldn't compare these for low light. I would compare these just dynamic range for the high gain mode, because for example, the red Gemini in this test is actually getting 2 more stops of light. So it's at an advantage in terms of low light, but we're still really just looking at the dynamic range of that setting. We just want to basically see, if you set any of these cameras to their high native ISO, even though they're different, what does the dynamic range look like, and what are you losing? Is it worth doing it? Because that's, that adds a lot of flexibility, knowing that you can push up your gain your sensitivity and not have to lose too much dynamic range in a lot of situations goes a long way. It means you can stop down, it means you can use less light, you can do all kinds of stuff that, you know, it just gives you a lot of flexibility. The nice thing about the A7S III is it also has analog gain, so it gives you that sort of flexibility to shoot at a variety of ISOs, and, you know, changing your ISO actually does give you some advantage in low light in other, you know, in between ISOs. Whereas with the red and the, no, actually the same with that. But whereas with the red, you only have two sensitivity modes, and any ISO changes you're making besides that standard to low light change is really affecting it's going to affect your noise performance, you know, linearly. So if you push it a stop, your noise is going to get worse by a stop. Whereas with cameras with analog gain like the ZCam and the A7S III, you actually, you know, it's better to, if you really want less noise, you can turn up your ISO and it will always be a little bit better. You'll lose your highlights and you might lose your overall dynamic range, but for the midtones and for, you know, for the image, if the image needs to be brighter, it's better to turn up your ISO. Don't get that wrong about this. So now that you've seen the dynamic range comparison between all these cameras, the next thing to look at is just the A7S III versus itself. So I stepped through a whole range of ISOs on this on the A7S III, and my takeaways looking at this chart, if you look at the first couple of ISOs, they're pretty good. The 640 is definitely still better than any of the other ones. But you know, it's not so bad going up to 1600 or so, and then things start to get a little crazy after around 4000. I really would approach with caution, you know, any ISO between 4000 and 10,000 in S-Log3. They really start getting, the codec really doesn't handle the type of noise well. It looks bad, and you really see how much better it gets when you switch from 10,000 to 12,800. It's night and day, basically. And then the ones over 12,800 look pretty good too, but you know, you start to see the same thing where you get this really chunky noise as you get even really past 25,600. And it gets, you know, exponentially worse up at the higher ISOs, but they look pretty good compared to even 10, you know, the 5,000 to 10,000 ISO, which are probably some of the worst settings that this camera has to offer. So what I really found in this, in the comparison with other ISOs, is that if you're trying to compare ISO 12,800 to lower ISOs and figure out, you know, where, you know, what it sort of correlates to, what other ISOs have similar amounts of noise, similar dynamic range, is that I found actually it's somewhere in between 1280 and 2000, because it depends whether you're looking at the midtones or the shadows. Sort of just goes back to the complexity of characterizing dynamic range, where it doesn't tell you the whole story, and you're going to run into issues if you're going by simplified quantifications of these things. The one thing to note about this kind of test is, one nice thing is that I was using the same lens for all of these cameras, and I was looking at the same bright chip on every single camera to set exposure. I was trying to set exposure so that white chip, the very top white chip, blew out. So what that also tells me is, it tells me where these cameras lie in terms of how much ND you would need to protect your highlights. I can tell you that the A7S III actually, compared to all these cameras, needs a little less ND if you're going to protect your highlights, because it only needed me to stop down to an f1.8 versus the E2-F6, which was an f2, and the red Gemini was an f2.2. So that means that you need, you know, another 2/3 of a stop of ND to protect, you know, a blown highlight on the red versus the A7S III, which is, you know, nice to know. And you know, compared to the A7S II, it's no comparison, because that needed an f3.2. So that's like a full 2 stops basically. which, you know, isn't surprising because we're shooting S-Log2 and the lowest ISO was 1600, which, you know, indicates that you're going to need more more ND outside to get to that, to get the right exposure level, and so the highlights just don't hold as well there. So those are my charts. You've seen it all. You can make your own conclusions. You've heard mine. I'm going to do some more testing. You know, feel free to write a comment and let me know if there's anything else you want to see. Hopefully, I can test some other cameras with this methodology. I'm finding it pretty useful because, you know, there are a lot of little things that you don't capture by looking at a number or by looking at analyzing a gray only Xyla chart, for example. So yeah, signing off. That's it.